The International Labor Organization turns our attention to the plight of workers as opposed to countries. And this is a perpetual dilemma in market capitalism, with firms facing a never-ending incentive to reduce costs in order to increase profits, which very often comes down to worker pay as well as other cost-saving measures. The ILO is headquartered in Geneva and consists of 187 countries or member states. The mandate is to recommend to members regulations for the safety and health of workers. The key structure of the ILO: it is a plenary organization that includes representatives of government, unions, and employers, and it issues recommendations or conventions to states. The key obligations created by membership in the ILO are that member states must consider ILO conventions for adoption, but are not required to adopt them. In terms of enforcement, the governing body can recommend punishments against countries that fail in their obligations under the conventions. Those punishments often involve inner organizational sanctions like loss of voting rights, but it rarely could lead to external sanctions on countries. All this is highly unlikely. At the end of World War I, the architects of the Treaty of Versailles believed that future wars could arise from economic inequalities between states or from a hyper-competitive race to the bottom among national labor regulations. They felt there was a connection between the mistreatment of workers domestically and the tendency for international conflict via either domestic social unrest or friction with trading partners. So initially, the goal is coordinating labor standards across countries. And global capitalism produces incentives for exporting countries to lower their labor standards in order to gain competitive advantage in international trade. This can be bad for workers. It could also be bad for social stability and bad for international peace and order. The ILO is unique in that non-state actors are involved, such as labor unions and firms, and also, it is a little bit limited compared to other organizations because members can choose on a case-by-case basis whether they will comply with ILO decisions. The ILO remains the central international body responsible for encouraging labor standards through law across a nearly global membership. It is therefore potentially a useful instrument to be used by the advocates of internationally mandated labor standards. However, it has received little attention by those looking to institutionalize common standards. It also contains a unique and interesting means of reconciling organizational authority with state sovereignty. It makes rules that only become binding on states when the states explicitly consent to each rule. In the terms of this text and how we look at this class, it is very revealing in using this different method to achieve compliance. It makes a significant sacrifice in the ambition of its legal rules in order to gain a high rate of compliance. It is unique among international organizations also in that it allows non-state actors such as business groups and labor unions to participate as official members of the national delegations. The ILO is composed of three parts: an assembly of delegates from all member states, known as the International Labor Conference, a smaller assembly of 56 of those delegates, known as the governing body, which operates as the executive committee in the ILO, and a secretariat known as the International Labor Office, to provide bureaucratic support to the other two bodies. The ILC meets once a year to draft new labor standards, set the organization's budget and finances, admit new member states, and provide a general forum for the discussion of labor issues. The governing body meets more frequently and provides much more of the monitoring of existing labor conventions. The delegates to both the ILC and the governing body include representatives of governments as well as representatives from labor and employer groups. So I encourage you to pay just a little bit of attention to this. I'm not going to read over it, but it sort of shows you where delegates are placed and how they become involved in the International Labor Organization. The substantive work of the ILO comes when it adopts new labor standards. These come in the form of conventions and recommendations and must be approved by a 2/3 majority vote in the ILC. Conventions include legally binding policy changes. Only once a convention has been ratified by a state is the convention legally binding on it. States therefore have an entirely legal way to avoid taking on new obligations as the ILC passes new conventions. Today, there are 189 conventions in force, of which 8 are considered by the ILO to be of fundamental importance. About 2/3 of the ILO's member states have adopted all 8 fundamental conventions. Member states take on 2 distinct kinds of obligations by joining the International Labor Organization: general obligations to the Constitution of the ILO and specific obligations to conventions and recommendations. The primary general commitment of ILO member states is to consider for ratification all conventions and recommendations adopted by the International Labor Conference. Therefore, the primary obligation of members is to consider ratifying the rules proposed in the conventions, and this means that whether they reject or adopt the convention, the ILO Constitution requires the state to report back to the organization on its decision, along with either the reasons for declining or the measures it plans to take to implement it. So the ILO does not compel non-ratifying countries to follow the rules of the conventions that they do not adopt. However, with each new convention that the organization creates, it does expand the realm of obligation of states by increasing the reporting obligations that it requires from its members. Aside from the general obligations, the ILO can also create very specific types of legal obligations. The Convention on Forced Labor, for instance, requires that states take effective measures to secure the immediate and complete abolition of forced or compulsory labor. The Convention defines the key term, forced labor, and then invites ILO members to ratify the convention through their domestic legal systems. However, there is also flexibility built in so that states with more strict rules on a subject are not required by an ILO convention to weaken them. Article 19.8 says that conventions and recommendations cannot be used to lessen existing labor regulations. The ILO is built around 2 institutional devices to encourage compliance by member states: tripartism and volunteerism. These both represent institutional innovations as compared to these other organizations we look at in this book. Tripartism involves the inclusion of non-governmental delegates, and this is an attempt to ensure that when conventions are passed by the ILC, they have already been vetted by important domestic constituencies in each state. Volunteerism is the second device, and this involves a 2-stage approval process for new conventions. And that is what we have already described: first agreeing to the conventions within the international organization, and then ratifying domestic law to be in accordance with that agreement. And the ILO is willing to accept a lower rate of adoption in favor of a higher rate of compliance among the states that do adopt these conventions, with the hope that within these smaller groups of countries that adopt a stricter labor standard, peer pressure keeps them in check and keeps them from reneging on their promises to the ILO. And this is oftentimes the case with the 8 core human rights conventions that have been adopted for public relations, as signaling to other countries that there are stable conditions in the member state of question and they are a safe trading partner. The ILO has some capacity to enforce its conventions against states that have ratified but not complied with them. These rules are primarily described in Articles 24, 26, and 33 of the ILO Constitution. The system works on the basis of complaints about the failure of a member state to fulfill its obligations under a convention. These can be investigated by a committee of member states from the ILO and may lead to censure or expulsion from the organization. Complaints about noncompliance on the part of a state can be submitted to the ILO by a variety of agents, including worker or employer groups, member states of the ILO, or the governing body itself. A complaint in the ILO takes the form of what the ILO calls a representation, that a member state has failed to implement an ILO convention which that member accepted. This is defined in Article 24 and 26. Once this claim is made, the state in question is given an opportunity to respond, although it is not mandatory that the target be given the chance to answer these charges, and then the governing body makes a judgment about whether the matter should be further investigated by a committee of the ILC known as a commission of inquiry. If the governing body judges that an investigation is necessary, the commission prepares a report embodying its findings on all questions of fact and makes recommendations that should be about steps that should be taken, and the report is then made public and the parties to the dispute are asked to respond. If the report substantiates a complaint against a member, that state can be asked to change its policies, and its behavior is then monitored by the governing body and ultimately by the general membership of the ILO sitting in the International Labor Conference. Despite this enforcement structure, the logic of the ILO in general rests on encouraging self-motivated compliance rather than centralized coercive enforcement. In fact, the ILO's history of enforcement is thin. The working premise behind the organization is that states can be induced to improve their conditions for workers by recognizing their self-interest and by the subtle play of international norms and adverse publicity that can sway countries that fall below standards. This is an entirely different model than employed by the Security Council and the ICJ. International organizations are, in general, poorly equipped to win direct contests of political power with their members, but there's only been really one historical case with Myanmar that the ILO won, and that was a quite limited success. So power struggles between international organizations and their members are not necessarily unheard of, and states tend to be the most powerful. As a result, finding empirical evidence that the ILO improves labor standards is not easy. This is not because it is necessarily ineffectual, but largely because the process through which it influences states is mixed with so many other political influences that it is very difficult to trace the independent effect of the ILO. So if you made it this far, you're awesome and you deserve a meme. And I went with a constructivist theme for no reason at all this week, except for it's been circulating on the internet and it caught my eye.